Good afternoon. I'm Arthur Brooks, president of the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this opening session for this evening from AEI's grand opening week of this building. This session is entitled The Future of Conservatism. The original title was The Future of Traditional Conservatism, Disaster or Apocalypse. We've decided that we're going to put a slightly more optimistic spin on things, and we have a terrific panel that I'm about to talk about just here in a second. For those of you who are visiting us for the first time, this is the new home of the American Enterprise Institute. After 78 years in rented quarters, we're delighted to be here. We've been able to move into these quarters entirely because of the generosity of our incredible supporters. The name on the outside of this building is Daniel A. Daniello. For those of you who don't know Dan Daniello, he's the founder of Carlyle, the private equity firm here. And his life is really, I think it typifies the values of the American Enterprise Institute. He grew up poor, he had a single mother. He was sort of found as a good student, got a full scholarship to Syracuse University, where I met him because I was on the faculty there for a long time. And he really built his life on the basis of hard work and personal responsibility. And he has dedicated his philanthropy to the American ideas of being able to treat your own life as a startup, whether you're an entrepreneur or not. It's an inspirational story and one that I couldn't be prouder to have his name on our building. These are the values that we stand for and that our scholars stand for as well. And I know you do too, or you wouldn't be interested in our work. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoy, for many years to come, our new building. We're planning to be here for the next 100 years, at which time I will be 152 and ready to retire. So, when one contemplates the future of conservatism, there's always a question in our minds. You know, when I talk to my evangelical Christian friends about what they should do in life, they always have this little device. They say WWJD, what would Jesus do? Well, as conservatives, we always ask WWBD, what would Buckley do at a time like this? And this is kind of a spooky old building. Perhaps we can conduct a seance. We're going to do the next best thing. We're going to have three proteges of Bill Buckley himself discuss the future of conservatism. First, we're going to talk to editor-in-chief, really, who took over the entire legacy, the written legacy of Bill Buckley, Rich Lowry, who now runs National Review magazine. National Review is a magazine that I've been reading for a very long time. I read National Review before anybody realized that I was a conservative, which is to say, before I got tenure at Syracuse University. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate the wisdom that's gone into it, both under Bill Buckley's tutelage and later Rich's, and I'm really fortunate to count him as a friend. He's going to moderate a panel with two AEI scholars that you see over here, Jonah Goldberg and Ramesh Ponnuru, who are also senior editors at National Review. What a great honor it is for me to share personnel with National Review magazine. It truly is, and it is for my other colleagues as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rich Lowry to illuminate the future of conservatism. Rich Lowry and my colleagues, Ramesh and Jonah.
Thank you, Arthur. Thanks, everyone. The other thing we're doing here today is very important, is marking Ramesh Ponnuru's 20 years at National Review. So an alternate title for this panel might be Ramesh's View on Conservatism. And there's really only one expert about that topic on our panel this morning. Sorry, Jonah. But I have known and worked with Ramesh before he was of legal drinking age, not that he let that stop him. He arrived at National Review from Princeton around 1996 as a very enthusiastic supporter of Phil Gramm. In fact, if I remember correctly, Ramesh actually authored National Review's endorsement of Phil Gramm in 1996, and the experience of making the case for an entirely uncharismatic, rock-ribbed conservative who would go on to lose the Republican nomination perfectly prepared Ramesh for his work on our Ted Cruz endorsement earlier this year. Ramesh was actually told by a mentor of his when he was a teenager, that he was born to write editorials for National Review, and that's really true. His prose is incredibly sharp. His analysis is acute. He knows a frightening amount, and he is unsparingly honest and fair-minded. You know, in the age of social media and Twitter, we engage with one another more than we ever have before. We disagree with each other. We mock and abuse one another. But very few people ever actually argue anymore. And that's always what Ramesh does. And it can be very humbling to work with Ramesh. Once every 2 weeks when we're putting the magazine out, Ramesh and I, over the phone, edit together the front of National Review. It's called The Week. There are about 30, 40 editorial items, about 6,000 words or so. And we'll spend, I'm in New York, he's down here in DC, we'll spend an hour or two on the phone going over in detail this document, changing commas, trying to sharpen endings, all the rest of it. And a couple years ago, I was the one in charge of the files. We're talking together. And when we were done finally, I hit something wrong, and I totally lost every single change we had done. And I said to Ramesh, I'm such an idiot. I just lost everything. And Ramesh said, not to worry. I think I remember everything we did. And sure enough, 15 minutes later, he had sent it back totally restored. But all that said, I really think the most impressive thing about Ramesh is that he's been microaggressed against by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. At the World Forum down at Sea Island earlier this year, we were at an event for the Dalai Lama, and beforehand, April and Ramesh told me the story about an event for the Dalai Lama down here in Washington, where the Dalai Lama pointed to Ramesh and said, "You're from India." And Ramesh had to say, "No, actually, I'm from Kansas." And we had a good chuckle over this, and at the end of the event in Sea Island, the Dalai Lama was leaving, made a beeline for Ramesh, and sure enough said, "You're from India." And the Dalai Lama's aide kind of scurried up after him and said, "No, Your Holiness, he's from Kansas." And Ramesh, you have done Kansas proud. You've done National Review proud. Thank you for all you've done for us, and congratulations. Now, one of the joys of being an editor is you get to take credit for your colleagues' brilliant work that you have nothing to do with. But I cannot take credit for discovering Ramesh. That's my predecessor, John O'Sullivan, who wrote a few words he wanted me to share this afternoon. John writes, and forgive the occasional Britishism, he's British. One day in the early 1990s, Linda Bridges, the managing editor of the magazine at that time, brought a difficult but pleasant problem to me at National Review. We are judging the entrance to a young writers competition. Prizes 1 year at National Review for the winner and 2 years for the runner-up. Well, the runner-up was Rich Lowry, who never managed to escape from the magazine at all. History does not record where the winner ended up, but Linda's problem concerned a third writer who had written a brilliant essay but who did not meet the other requirements. We had defined young writers as writers between ages 17 and 25, and this entrant was, I'm afraid, only 15. Well, we solved that problem by creating a special prize for the writer, a schoolboy called Ramesh Ponnuru, and thought no more about it. 2 years later, I was invited to speak to a conservative society at Princeton, and Ramesh was in the audience. After I had spoken, Ramesh approached me in that straightforward, candid, no-nonsense American way and asked me for a job. And being English, I was too embarrassed to refuse. He was, of course, an early and brilliant success at the magazine, first as an editorial intern, and after a very few steps, as the senior editor he is today. Moreover, Ramesh violated a long-standing tradition at National Review established by Bill Buckley and continued under me, which was leaving the magazine and becoming a left-winger 15 minutes later. On the contrary, Ramesh was one of the first conservative journalists to break out of the right-wing ghetto and storm the citadels of the mainstream media. That may not seem very impressive to many of you in the room, because my guess is that almost all of you have done the same thing. But some of us can remember the days when there was a conservative needed when a conservative needed to meet one of three criteria for getting onto a mainstream news program. 1, to be a son of the presenter. 2, to be a nephew of the presenter. Or 3, to be very, very, very brilliant. That last criterion, though, might keep you off the program. Who can forget Bill Maher's reproach to Ramesh on Social Security, quote, "You've been studying this," end quote. Ramesh rose on the basis of brilliance, an amazingly versatile brilliance at which has also brought him to dine at Arthur Brooks's high table at the American Enterprise Institute to dispense the best of high thinking on law, economics, society, and much else. In all these things, he has been scrupulous in presenting his arguments on the most controversial of topics clearly, persuasively, and above all, honestly. There is no hint of the trimmer in his makeup, nor of the fanatic either. Where will his gifts take him in the next 2 decades? Politics, the law, journalism, Hollywood. It's impossible to predict. I would say editor of the New York Times, except that Ramesh isn't 15 years old anymore. Thank you, everyone. Now we'll begin our panel discussion. So, Jonah, this is the part of the program where you share your praise of Ramesh.
No. I'm here to provide balance and give the opposing point of view. My understanding is that Ramesh had his first op-ed in the Financial Times when he was 19, and it's always been my impression that he's been coasting ever since. I think he's. I should correct one thing, which is one of the privileges of being a senior editor is you always get to second guess the boss. The best part of the Dalai Lama story was when the Dalai Lama accused Ramesh of being from India, and Ramesh said, "No, I'm from Kansas." Arthur Brooks then leaned over to the Dalai Lama and said, "That's all right. They all look like that in Kansas." I find it, look, I, as being a sci-fi geek, I've always wanted to have a close personal friend who's a Vulcan. And so I've always been honored and privileged to have Ramesh as a resource for me. And I can tell that the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree because Ramesh's adorable daughter, Betsy, is up here in the front row. She's 6, and she's furiously taking notes. So beyond that, congratulations, Ramesh, and to 20 more great years.
Thank you.
So, Ramesh, before we dive in and talk a little bit about the predicament and opportunity of contemporary conservatism, share with us a little bit, if you will, how you became a conservative. Did you go through a Marxist phase, say, from age 12 to 13?
So this is the part where I praise myself, right? Well, thank you for the
We are in Washington.
very, very kind, generous words that you've all had. Well, I was blessed to be raised in an apolitical household, and I was just somebody who was very interested in politics, and I read a lot, and I watched some firing lines. And one of the things I read was Atlas Shrugged, because I had some conservative friends who kept pushing it on me, and that probably delayed my becoming a conservative by a good year or two, because that never had any appeal whatsoever to me. But I also read National Review. I met a senator once who said that National Review was his best friend when he was in high school. I wasn't quite that lame, but I did read and enjoy and learn from it. And
was his name Ted? Just.
As a professional journalist, I respect the anonymity of my sources.
That was a non-denial. Anyway, go on.
So, Ramesh, we've praised you to the skies and talked about how acute your judgment is and how sound it is, but you were pretty much as wrong as most of us were about Donald Trump. So what did we miss, and what does it tell us about the state of our politics?
Well, I would say I was at least as wrong as everybody else. I had the silly idea that if 60% of the voters thought that you were unqualified to be president, and that number never declined, that in the end you probably wouldn't become president. That turned out to be spectacularly wrong. If you had unfavorable ratings at the same level that were significantly worse than your major opponent, you probably were going to lose the election. That also turned out to be wrong. And I'm one of many people who's trying to reevaluate a lot of things about American politics as a result. I think one other thing, I was always skeptical of the idea that Obama's success reflected his personal charisma. It seemed to me that there were some structural advantages that Democratic candidates running in 2008 and 2012 had, some of which I expected to carry over to somebody else. And I think that in retrospect, you have to look at some of his charisma and Hillary Clinton's distinct lack thereof as being really, in the end, decisive. We all spent much of the year, and not just you and me, but pundit land in general, saying anybody else as a Republican nominee would be beating Hillary Clinton handily. And maybe one of the things that should have told us is she's a really weak candidate, and he could beat her too.
And do you still think that's true, that any other Republican would have beaten her?
I think you would have had a different geographic pattern. So I don't think that let's say a John Kasich or a Marco Rubio would probably have gotten as many votes from white voters without college degrees as Trump ended up doing, and thus probably the Republicans wouldn't have carried Michigan, wouldn't have carried Pennsylvania. On the other hand, they might have been more in contention in Colorado, probably would have picked up New Hampshire. Maybe we'd have had a flipped over result where the Republicans won the popular vote, but didn't have at least quite as many electoral votes as they ended up getting.
And what's your current state of mind about just the balance of equities for conservatism here? Because you look at the early cabinet appointments and you close your eyes and Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz could have made most of these appointments. And it seems as though we may get out of Congress 75% of a Paul Ryan agenda, say. But at the same time, the guy at the top is not a conservative, and there's still obviously a risk of him sort of tainting conservatism and what we all believe. So what's your state of mind on that at the moment?
Well, it does look like a pretty standard conservative Republican cabinet with some Trumpian sprinkles that bear some watching. Although the process by which the cabinet is being put together is certainly unusual. I don't think we've ever had a cabinet put together on Twitter before, which maybe that's just part of our bright new future, part of making America great again. I think that one of those salutary developments that may come out of a Trump presidency, and this is at least something that I think we should work toward, is having a little bit more of a transactional attitude as conservatives toward the presidency. I think that it would be a healthy development if congressional Republicans tried to figure out sort of what they can get that's good out of this presidency and what they can do to prevent things that are bad, but not sort of overinvest and over-identify with the president and with his personality in a way that I think is always a temptation given the way the modern presidency has accumulated both real and cultural power, but is maybe an especially problematic temptation with this particular president-elect.
So, Jonah, where are you on that? Because obviously you planted your flag very strongly in never Trump territory. In fact, my defense, if there was going to be show trials in a Trump administration, my defense was going to be the whole against Trump issue of National Review was Jonah's idea. So where are you? How optimistic are you about what we might see?
I agree with a lot of what Ramesh said. I've long wanted more of a transactional relationship. I thought the conservative movement got in a lot of trouble under George W. Bush by blurring in part because of the exigencies of a war and the cravenness and cynicism of the left's attacks on George W. Bush when he was a wartime president, that there was an impulse to just rally around the president on the right, and that made conservatives seem to blur the distinctions between Republicans and conservatives. And at National Review, we criticized lots of things that George W. Bush did, from creating the Department of Homeland Security and No Child Left Behind and Medicare Part D. But it all got drowned out because the only issue that people were talking about was the war, and we were supporting him on the war. And I think that it's probably healthy for both the Republican Party and the conservative movement to get a little more critical distance, and we've certainly got enough critical distance right now. I planned on waking up the morning after the election in a mood that could best be characterized as the living envying the dead. And it turned out I was in a remarkably good mood because it dawned on me, oh my gosh, first of all, we're going to get the judges and we're going to get Obamacare and all that. But and this is maybe a selfish reaction, I had no ownership of this guy. I had no obligation to defend him. I had no obligation to bend my principles in any way because I was so passionately against the guy from the beginning. And so I will happily, and I think National Review will happily, I don't want to speak for you, but will happily support him when he does the right thing. That a lot of these appointments are great. Personally, my own hope, we can talk about some of the structural issues in conservatism and how we got to this mess and the rise of sort of populism, which I'm very critical of. But my own personal view is that character is destiny. And I think Donald Trump's character is not, this is an august meeting, I will use restraint, is not ideally suited for the job of President of the United States. And
I'm so glad you're not working blue today.
And so my real hope is that we clear out all the low-hanging fruit that every never-Trumper and every passionate Trump supporter can agree upon. Obamacare, the executive orders, conservative justices. My real concern is that I think right now Donald Trump didn't expect to win. I think he more wanted to win than be president. And so right now he's sobered by the fact that he's going to be president of the United States. You wouldn't know it necessarily from his early morning tweets, but I think that right now we are in the equivalent of the first 30 minutes of the first debate, where he's taking it really seriously. And so far I don't have a lot to complain about. What I worry about is what happens when Donald Trump takes it as a given that of course they should play Hail to the Chief when he enters a room. Of course Marines should salute him when he gets off the Marine One and all that. And then his sense of entitlement and his character comes back to the fore and we get into some trouble. But until then, I think there's an enormous amount of good that can be done, and I will be happily cheerlead the good that is done until I think the problems reassert themselves.
It seems to me the most encouraging event the last 3 weeks or so was when Donald Trump went into the meeting in the Oval Office with Barack Obama and seemed visibly nervous and out of place, as though after 16 months of running for president, it actually dawned on him now he's going to be president of the United States.
Right.
And the gravity of the most weighty office on the planet was finally hitting him. But Ramesh, Jonah alluded to these structural issues within conservatism that may have led to the Trump phenomenon. Can you address that? What were the weaknesses in conservatism, and were there ways for conservatives to address them before the apple cart got entirely upset by this populist outsider?
Well, I do think that conservatives had gotten a little too attached to a particular program of action that was created in the late 1970s and early 1980s and gradually drifted away from being relevant to people's circumstances, and in particular drifted away from the circumstances of working class people who in a lot of ways have had a lot of economic pressure over the last couple of decades. Not necessarily decline, but at least stagnation, certainly compared to the 50s, 60s, and even 70s when their material lot had been increasing. And at the same time, of course, there's the social situation. The deterioration of the family was accelerating. And conservatives, I think too often we're talking about we're going to cut the top tax rate, we're going to deregulate, we're going to free up trade, and eventually all of this is going to help you. And it just wasn't a compelling message for people. And of course, a lot of us at National Review had been arguing that we needed not to break with the spirit of Reaganism, but to update the program, to modernize it, to address the circumstances we're actually in. And it didn't really make a lot of headway among Republican leaders, and it ended up, I think, causing a kind of eruption this year. So that part of our analysis, I think, has been vindicated, maybe not in a way that we would have wanted to see.
Yeah, if I can just vent about that for a second. For years, people like Ramesh, places like National Review, places like the American Enterprise Institute, scholars like Michael Strain and Arthur Brooks have been making these arguments about sort of hewing to Reaganite principles, but dealing with the problems that we have today. And a lot of the sort of professional high priests of conservatism would accuse anybody who said we're going to deviate from traditional Reagan platform in any way. We're rhinos, we're squishes, we're Me Too Republicans, and all the rest. And the problem is that if those sort of gatekeepers, particularly in talk radio, were less interested in locking into their model and their talking points, it is entirely possible that we could have done a lot more for the white working class and the working class in general. I mean, I get the white working class is suffering, but it's not like the black working class is just going gangbusters. It's the American working class has problems, and places like AEI, places like Conservative Reform Network, places like National Affairs have been making these arguments for quite a while, and the gatekeepers, the sort of professional, sort of entertainment wing of the conservative movement, was just trying to shut that down at any cost as deviationism. And then what was so frustrating about the rise of Trump is many of those same voices then said, you don't want to help the white working class, you don't want to help these people, Trump is the only one who's going to help them. Maybe if we had actually maybe if they hadn't been so cynical about all of this and we could have made progress on these issues, we could have indoctrinated the white working class into a more traditional form of conservatism without the pitchforks and mob mentality that we've gotten with the populist moment of the last 18 months.
Yeah, so you had, go ahead.
Just add one thing that's distinct but overlaps, which is immigration. It's the specific issue of immigration, where, before Trump got into the race, remember there were 16 other people, and all of them were, well, except for Rick Santorum, who was sort of an asterisk in the race, were taking the view that we should increase legal immigration, like the 2013 bill, which doubled legal immigration levels, and that we should have an amnesty for illegal immigrants. This was, at the presidential level of Republican politics, there was a kind of attempt to create this consensus that just didn't fit the actual voters in the Republican Party.
So Jonah, talk to us a little bit about your problems with populism, because it would seem this year to have proven to have a lot of appeal, and absent that populist appeal, Hillary Clinton would be president of the United States. And it seems over the long term, the Republican Party is going to have to swap states like Virginia and Colorado, which are becoming more diverse, have more highly educated voters, for places in the Rust Belt where that Trump message really resonated. The last couple of weeks when Trump was saying that this globalized elite had come in and literally stolen, he would say this, literally stolen everything valuable in your town and taken it out. And we all, at least a lot of us, thought that was completely unhinged, and it was Trump giving up, and it was Trump building an audience for a Trump TV network after the election. No, it really hit home, and it may have helped really get him over the top, barely in the states that made him president.
Although that's not dispositive that he wasn't trying to build up an audience for a TV network, but that's neither here nor there. Yeah, look, this is a panel about the future of conservatism. It's being held in a place, at the American Enterprise Institute. We're all editors of National Review. And so I think it's important to emphasize that the challenge of populism for a political party is very different from the challenge of populism for an intellectual movement. And this is, and the conservative movement has been riven by these arguments for a very long time. Wilmore Kendall hated Russell Kirk. Wilmore Kendall said that he was a Rockies to the Appalachians populist, and he just thought that the flyover people, not to be derogatory, were the repository of all wisdom, and we should go with them, and who cares about states' rights, and who cares about these pointy-headed Burkean issues. And these arguments have taken place between the new right and the traditional conservative right and the Buckleyite right for a very, very long time. And so in a lot of ways, this isn't new as an argument within conservatism proper. But the problem with populism is that it is, as a historical matter, anti-intellectual. It just simply is anti-intellectual. My favorite quote, which some of you may have heard me say before, it comes from William Jennings Bryan, when he said that, this famous populist leader, he says, the people of Nebraska are for free silver, therefore I am for free silver. I will look up the arguments later. And the whole point of places like National Review and the American Enterprise Institute is that the arguments matter, that ideas have consequences, as Richard Weaver put in his book, Ideas Have Consequences. And for me, Donald Trump got into the primaries talking about how single payer works great in Canada and works great in Scotland and all of that, and maybe so good he's changed his mind on all of that. But I don't think he read a single position paper that caused him to change his mind. It was purely a pragmatic concession to the demands of the Republican Party. And as an intellectual movement, we have to be very careful not to be seduced by the gravitational pull of populist passion. If the people are for single-payer health care, we should still be against it because we've looked up the arguments. And it's a much different tension for the Republican Party because, again, as Bill Rusher, who was the publisher of National Review, always used to tell young new hires at National Review, he would say, look, politicians will always disappoint you. And it's not because politicians are necessarily horrible people, although many are. It's because politicians have a different set of incentives than young intellectual scribes and scholars at think tanks have. And they tend, there's a famous French intellectual who said, the people have chosen and I must go with them for I am their leader. And that is a fine, or at least an understandable attitude for politicians. It is a fundamentally immoral and unacceptable position for people who pretend to be intellectuals or upholders of a principle. We are all Calvin Coolidgists in this sense, in that he said one with the majority is one with the law on his side is a majority. One with the right argument on his side is right, and that is how conservative intellectuals should behave. And if that creates challenges for us in terms of donors or subscribers, fine, deal with the challenges, but let's not surrender to the mob just because they have numbers on their side.
You'll never make it on
Spoken
the
like
left
someone
bank.
who's not an editor or publisher of National. So, Ramesh, one, do you endorse that basic view? And two, how do we square that with, Buckley's famous statement, I'd rather be governed by the first 5,000 people in the Boston phone book than the Harvard faculty. Conservatism has always had this populist element to it.
Yeah, I think I think it's compatible with what he said. I mean, you have to sift. You take the good elements and try to get rid of the bad ones. I think, part of what Bill was trying to articulate there was that, we don't want to be ruled by experts. And sometimes a healthy conservatism, I think he wrote a column after the Reagan presidency where he said, sometimes you needed a leader who was going to say, and who was capable of saying, shucks, professor, I think you're wrong. But that's not the same thing as a blanket disdain for expertise, for knowledge that populism is sometimes prone to. And in addition to the point that Jonah made, which I wholeheartedly endorse, that we shouldn't be for things just because they're popular, although of course we have to take those things into account because, as Bill and Whittaker Chambers also always said, life is maneuvering. There's just a practical point, which is it is not clear that a populist Trumpian approach is going to work for people not named Donald Trump. Just as the Obama political formula didn't work when Obama wasn't on the ballot, this may be something that you have to be Trump to pull off. We saw a very few candidates attempt to run as mini Trumps during this same year, and they failed pretty spectacularly.
Yeah, I remember Trump in one of these debates. It was when the faux bromance with Ted Cruz had ended because Trump was gaining on Cruz, and Iowa, and they began to attack each other viciously and really personally. And someone asked during one of the debates, Trump, why are you attacking Ted Cruz now? He's like, because he's going up in the polls, and no one else, no other politician could possibly say that and get away with it, and Trump could. I remember the Iowa State Fair. This is the first sign that the gravity had been reversed, where you had Scott Walker, this nice, genuinely working class Midwesterner, being out-populist by this guy who was giving kids rides on his personal helicopter. But Ramesh, this anti-intellectualism that you both addressed, has that, even prior to Trump, had that seeped too much into conservatism?
Yes.
Yes. One of the problems I think that the conservative movement has been dealing with, for a lot of the problems of the conservative movement are problems of success. Fox News, talk radio, magazines, the internet, all these things have allowed us to sort of propagate and expand in ways that we could only have dreamed of 30 years ago. The downside is, and this is downstream of other cultural trends where people are cocooning, what they call the big sort, is that there are a lot of people who can make a really good living only talking to people who already agree with them. And the problem you get when you have that is that you stop talking about persuasion, which is what politics is supposed to be about, going back to Aristotle. Explain to someone why their interests are better reflected by joining your coalition than the coalition that they're in, and it becomes an exhortation about purity. And exhortations about purity, by definition, do not attract people who are less pure than you. And it becomes a shrinking phenomenon. And so in some ways, Trump should be congratulated for stumbling on this thing about saying it's not about purity. He sort of said, I'm not really I'm a conservative, but I'm not that conservative, and really, what does it matter, and all that kind of stuff. Makes me want to flip the safety on my rifle, but I get it, and it worked for him. But I think this is one of the things that the conservative movement needs to get back to, is figuring out how to persuade people that disagree with us, that we have better ideas, that we have better arguments, and stop. And also, look, I like anti-elitism. Bill Buckley, the Boston phone book thing, I agree with Bill Buckley entirely about that. But Bill Buckley was also a guy who used yacht as a verb, used winter as a verb in Stad, and played the harpsichord. Bill Buckley was not an anti-elitist. He was anti the existing elite. And this is a distinction that I think has been lost on a lot of people. If I draw any distinctions between things on Twitter or in column, people accuse me of being an elitist, and the answer is guilty as charged. I just don't like the elite that's actually running the country in a lot of the mainstream media, and I think we have to get back to making those distinctions.
When Arthur said that, asked the question, what would Buckley do? The first thing that came to my mind was ski. But I think that the anti-intellectualism has been a smaller problem for the right than a kind of inertia. It is very hard to get people to move off of a formula that has been successful. And the 70s, 80s conservative formula was successful for a very long time. And it just hit a point of diminishing returns. And I think there's a kind of symbiosis where if you think you've already got all the answers, your existing program is fine. You don't need to do thinking. And if you don't do that thinking, the muscles atrophy.
So we're going to open up for questions about 5 minutes or so, but really quickly we'll address a few other things. Jonah, another corruption of conservatism is the alt-right. What is the alt-right, and how should we regard it in your view?
All right, so this is, I think, a really important point that is getting lost, particularly because the mainstream media really wants to build up the alt-right into something that it is not. We at National Review have been dealing with the alt-right before it was called the alt-right. It's a bunch of cranks, racists, swamp dwellers, gnomes, trolls, and other members of the coprophagic phylum at the bottom of human society. And they are proudly racist, they are proudly anti-Semitic, and they believe essentially that the mud people are taking over. And but what they've done is they've managed to make themselves into a new, brave, anti-establishment voice. That's how they're portrayed. And I think, and I have, if people are interested, I had this argument with Hugh Hewitt, and I think I've persuaded him to my point of view. It is absolute folly for conservatives to talk about the alt-right as if they are part of the conservative coalition in any way. First of all, take them at their word. The word alt-right means alternative right. They explicitly, in their writing, say they want to replace traditional mainstream conservatism, AEI conservatism, Heritage Foundation conservatism, National Review conservatism, with this racially focused, this sort of idea that the Nordic people and all the rest are superior, and that Western civilization is great so long as you look at it through a racial prism. And so the challenge for conservatives is not to say, oh, well, they're the anti-establishment crowd, which is what people like Steve Bannon want to do, is they want to blur this distinction and make it sound like they're just part of this sort of anti-establishment movement, when in reality what we should be doing is drawing a very bright line around them and say, they're not part of us, they do not share our ideas, they do not share our agenda, it's an existential thing, they want to destroy us, why would we want them in our coalition? And one of the reasons why we should do that is if in the name of short-term expediency, you let them into your movement, you're going to lose a lot more people than you gain. Because there are a lot of very decent, sincere conservatives, far more decent, sincere, committed conservatives who do not want to be associated with racists and people who retweet David Duke and the rest. And frankly, a conservative movement that considers them a full-fledged member of the coalition is going to chase out people like me, and my guess is a lot of people in this room. And so the trick is to use them more as a Medusa's head, to petrify our enemies and say, you've been calling us racists and cranks for the last 50 years. We're not. They are. And if you don't like us, that's what's waiting in the wings. And so maybe you should listen to us and understand that we're not racist because we talk about immigration this way and all the rest. But this idea, the challenge is that when Bill Buckley was the editor of the magazine, you could shun the John Birch Society because there just were only so many outlets to the mainstream media and all the rest. And now this sort of balkanized, huge digital world, they're going to have platforms. They're going to be cynical people who are going to use them for clickbait, which is what Steve Bannon did. I don't think Steve Bannon, is a racist. I don't think Donald Trump is some Klansman. I don't think, the pillowcases at Mar-a-Lago have eye holes pre-cut in them or anything. But I think they cynically exploited those people because they thought that would help them, with this populist surge. And to some extent, I think they were right.
So Ramesh, just bring it back on a practical level really quickly. Obamacare, major priority, obviously on the Hill and is going to be in the White House. How much of it can they repeal, and how should they think about replacing it?
Well, I think that this is a classic case of the dog who caught the car. They are suddenly in a position where they can do something about Obamacare, but they haven't done a lot of the preparatory work to know what exactly they want to do. And so one of the things they're thinking about doing is trying to repeal as much of it as they can in a reconciliation bill, which is the kind of bill where you can bypass a filibuster and you can attack a lot of the spending and the taxes, but not the real regulatory heart of Obamacare, and say we're going to repeal it effective 2019, and that'll give us some time to come up with a replacement bill. I think this is a terrible idea, and in the end, I think that they'll figure out that it's a terrible idea and they won't do it. For one thing, because the whole thing kind of implodes even faster than it already has been. If you do that, if you tell people that they don't have to buy insurance anymore, because the mandate's no longer in effect. But what I think they can do is either attack it piecemeal, where you have a Medicaid bill that replaces what they did on Medicaid, a tax bill that changes what they did on tax policy and so forth, or you try to make some kind of deal where you bring in some Senate Democrats. The problem is, which I don't think a lot of Republicans have faced up to in the euphoria of having won, is that they don't have the votes in the Senate to do the full repeal and replacement that so many of us have been advocating.
So on that sobering note, let's open it up for questions with the last 10 or 15 minutes we have.
Please wait for the mics. Just wait.
Thank you. Tim Carney, Washington Examiner and AEI. While I like Jonah's idea of replacing the current elite with a new elite, because I think that would include most of my friends, when I was out on the campaign trail, what I saw was that they distrusted all elites because they thought not just that the elites were dumb, but that they thought the elites were going to be making decisions for them. So they don't want Harvard or AEI making decisions for them. And so you look at the populism. Laura Ingram's book title was what? Power to the People. How much of can conservatives find common ground with populism if what they look at is actually something like that, sort of decentralizing power in any way? Is that a promising road for populism and conservatism to go together?
I think it's a thorny political challenge, right? And I think, as someone who's a huge advocate for federalism and subsidiarity and pushing things down to the most local democratic level possible, I think you would solve a lot of those problems. One of the great things about having local authority, empowering local authorities, states' rights, however you want to put it, is that, first of all, in culture war arguments, the winners have to look the losers in the eye, right? As it is right now with these elitist arguments, you have sort of a Barbra Streisand coalition and a John Ashcroft coalition screaming at each other at the national level, and they're never going to run into somebody they disagree with. But if you have these fights at the most local level possible, you meet the winners meet the losers at the supermarket and at school events and all the rest, and it creates a certain humility on both sides. Moreover, the more local you push these things, the more likely it is that local voters know who to fire. If you look at like the VA scandal, you had 435 congressmen. Every single one of them was shocked and outraged by what happened, and no one knew who to fire. If you could push this down and make local officials accountable, I think it would give a lot of people much more of a sense that they actually do control what's going on in their own lives. And I think at the structural level, that is the best solution for all of that.
I mean, that's just the maximal scenario, right? The populists and the conservatives agree on decentralizing everything. The problem is a lot of the populists don't want to decentralize everything. They want to use government and big government for their own ends and do, $1 trillion Obama-style stimulus just allocated slightly differently into other states.
I did say it was thorny.
Yeah.
I think, in the last few years, there was a vogue for something called libertarian populism, which was, the grand theory that was going to...
Where was this vogue?
In
He's sitting right there.
But I think populism just naturally does not want to take a libertarian shape. I think one of the basic points of populism has to be the identification of a leader with the voice of the people. And once you've made that move, which I think there are strong elements of with Trump, it just lends itself much more naturally to a kind of statist, big government, even authoritarian approach than it does to a decentralizing and libertarian one. And you can see this, I think, one just small example of it, the protectionism that it is associated with. Protectionism is historically a formula for an alliance of big business and big government elites at the expense of the little people. And I don't see why it should prove any different this time.
Do you think strongman is inevitably tied to populism?
It's certainly as it is being used in this instance, I think that it's not just that, it's also the people are being identified with a subset of the actual population. That's another part of populism that I think is dangerous.
I think that Trump sentiment, "I alone can fix it," is fundamentally a populist sentiment. You just look throughout American history and you can imagine Andrew Jackson and Ross Perot and George Wallace saying that kind of thing. It's not really an ideas, doesn't lend itself to an ideas-based approach the same way post-war conservatism does.
Right.
The medicine's in the dose, I think, when it comes to populism.
All the way in the back?
This question is for Jonah. You rightly noted that purity tests tend to not work when you're in aggregational, coalitional politics, and basically noting that politics is about addition, not subtraction. But earlier in your remarks, you had lamented the inability of AEI and the other think tanks to, and I think you used the word indoctrinate the white working class in the proper form of conservatism before sort of the bad guys got to them. How do you reconcile the tension between these two concepts? On the one hand, you don't want to have any kind of purity test. On the other, there is a right form of conservatism with which one indoctrinates large groups of people before they should be allowed in.
For your sake, Joan, I was hoping this contradiction in your remarks would go unnoticed, but here we are.
Well, I don't recall using the word indoctrinate, but I won't run from it either. I think a
Wait,
better.
do we have a ruling? Did he use the word indoctrination, Ramesh?
I think a better word, had I had the opportunity.
Vulcan always remembers.
You should have mind melded with me earlier. A better word would be persuade, right? And you got to remember, National Review was it Dwight McDonald called them little magazines? I can't remember who it was.
Every time you speak, Jonah, our publisher Jack Fowler is like, "Please, no, we don't want to shrink. We don't want to lose readers."
No, but I mean, but famously, intellectual magazines, think tanks too, are basically B2B players, right? We help get these ideas out to other people in the media, to academics, to scholars, to politicians, and all the rest. And it is not necessarily a mass market enterprise. And I think one of the problems is the people who were engaged in the mass market enterprise didn't want to abandon their playbook. And so that was one of the barriers that we had, and I think it's one of the things that we have to sort of figure out how to get around and make these pitches more directly, or find intermediaries in the media who can carry these arguments better. So it's not indoctrination so much as it is persuasion, and maybe we need new models of persuasion.
Bradford.
Thank you. I'm Bradford Short. I'm an attorney who works in the city, but about 6 months ago I was a law professor in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and I've had the pleasure of helping all three of these gentlemen with some of their projects in the years, and I am, as long as Ramesh has worked at National Review, I've subscribed to it. I want to just
I think there's a warning for you there, Jack, on future personnel decisions.
I mean, the title of the panel is Conservatism, What Now? And in no way is what has been addressed not within that scope, but in many ways it's being addressed here, with the exception of what Jonah has said, to some degree, is how can conservatives stand for conservative reforms in our legislation in this very trying time? And that's transactional, and the movement towards transactionalism would be salutary in many ways. At the same time, conservatism is about more than that. And I, just in a personal level, I mean, I can say that I have never felt so ashamed of my fellow center-right people in my entire life than in the past 18 months. I had to repeatedly tell Muslim law students overseas that my movement and my party would never give in to racism and bigotry of the kind that Donald Trump regularly peddled in, whether he believes it or not, that he regularly peddled in. And at every single stage, I had to be proven wrong, that I completely didn't understand my own people, my own country, my own movement. So I guess this is the question, this is the point. If all these things happen, if all these great bills are passed, but Donald Trump commits horrific impeachable offenses, Donald Trump disgraces the presidency in a way that we can't even contemplate, but all of us expect, what do we do then? What if the only people who want to impeach him are Democrats, and all Republican leaders don't want to impeach him, even though the clear original intent of the Constitution says we should impeach him? What is National Review and AEI prepared to do?
Yeah, Ramesh.
Well, I think there are sort of a couple questions in there, and I'll look at the time. Trump said a number of alarming things. We don't know, we've been told, not to take him seriously, but not literally, which is I mean, we're constantly told this, which is a really actually troubling thing to be told about a president-elect. But we don't know which of those things he's going to follow through on. We do have to be prepared to speak out. We need, one would hope that the conservative Republicans on the Hill will exercise oversight functions, even with the Republican president, in a way they never have before. My one caveat on all this stuff is let's start talking about impeachment after there's an impeachable offense. I mean, the guy's not president yet. We don't know what he's going to do with the power that he's about to be given. I certainly can see some very bad scenarios under a Trump presidency. My main problems with him, we talked a lot about Trumpism today, my main problems have never been the ideological ones. I disagree with him on trade. I can handle having a president with whom I disagree. In fact, that was inevitably going to happen given that Clinton was the other person in the race. My concerns about him, the serious ones, have been characterological, about things like impulse control, vindictiveness, pettiness, and so forth. All of those things, the election result does not cause me to reconsider those judgments. All I can do right now is hope that he is going to be moved by others and by his own conscience in a better direction. But we all do need to prepare for worst possible outcomes.
Well, it seems like the best case scenario is that the Trump that you see in tweets is roughly analogous to the Richard Nixon who wrote marginalias late at night on memos. Henry, we're going to nuke him at 9 a.m. And Henry Kissinger just sort of discard it in the morning. So hopefully all that is restrained and doesn't actually achieve any concrete expression.
Except Mike Flynn's is Kissinger.
Okay.
All right. That last question actually went a bit longer than we expected, so that will have to be the last one.
Right.
Thank you, everyone.
Well, let me thank AEI for putting this wonderful event on. And the question that Arthur asked at the outset, what would Buckley think? It's really unanswerable. He had idiosyncratic judgments on pretty much everything, but something that I am extremely confident in saying is that he would be very proud of my colleagues. Thanks, Ramesh and Joe.
Thanks again to all of you. What a wonderful panel. Great to see a full house. I hope you're going to enjoy a lot more this coming week and this very evening in our building. The last remarks I would like to make, I posed the question, what would Buckley do? But we really got the answer, what would Ramesh do? And that this is the new generation. This is what we're looking forward to. And the one thing that I will also state here is that we kept talking about conservative ideas. And when you read Ramesh, the words all throughout his writings, I mean, everything from the expansion of the earned income tax credit, really wonky, nutty, crunchy stuff. But really the ideas are what you read between the words. And the reason that I've been a fan and somebody I'm honored to call a colleague of Ramesh's is what's between the lines of everything he writes, which is about the inalienability of human dignity. That truly is a conservative idea. And to the extent that us at AEI and at National Review, those of you in this audience and all of us can remember, whether we're conservatives or liberals, that there is a radical equality of human dignity. And when we believe in that, we can make the country better. That's something I read from Ramesh, and it's something that I share with him, and I'm honored to call him my colleague and thank him tonight and congratulate him on his 20 years at National Review.